She stood on the threshold with her shoes in hand and 3 women behind her to watch. In a steady voice, she named the blows, first by the bed, then at the door, and finally in the yard for all to hear. This was how a Viking marriage ended, not with a whisper, but with witnesses and words that mattered. To understand why a doorway could be a courtroom, we need to go back to how Viking marriages were built in the first place. On silver, keys, kin, and bargains that tied farms together more tightly than any love song ever could. A Viking marriage started with a meeting of families, not hearts. The groom's kin brought the munder, the bride price, promising that their son wasn't just a man, but an investment with backing. The bride's side laid out the dowry, the hymen filgia, chests, cloth, livestock, tools, sometimes a few bright beads that had crossed half the world in other people's hands. Each piece said the same thing: we're serious. Meanwhile, the morning gift, the morgengifu, was pledged for the day after the wedding night, sealing the union with a personal promise from husband to wife. If you're hearing a lot of inventory, you're not wrong. Viking marriage lived in ledgers. Now, about those keys. You've seen the brooches and keys in museum cases, the sagas and later laws like Gragas. Remember the husfreyja as keeper of the household stores, the woman with the right to lock and unlock. Archaeology complicates the picture. Only a small share of women were buried with keys, and some keys wouldn't open anything. Still, inside the longhouse, the woman's authority wasn't a story. It was daily life. When her husband sailed, she held the farm together. Grain in, wool spun, debts noted, guests fed. If the house was a ship on dry land, she was at the tiller when the captain left. The alliance mattered even more than the couple. A marriage rearranged obligations between kin groups, grazing rights, boat shares, winter fodder loans, protection in lawsuits. 2 fathers might shake hands with a butchered ox cooling between them, meat for the feast, hide for a future shield, fat saved in a jar. A marriage was practical magic. It turned strangers into people who owed each other. Because the union was contractual, it had built-in exits. The very terms that made it could unmake it. If a man's luck collapsed, bad harvests, lost cattle, a ship gone to splinters, the pressure flowed along the alliance. Families expected marriages to endure, but they also wrote terms for when they couldn't. Think of it like this. If your neighbor's roof caves in, do you patch it forever, or do you agree it's safer to move? The law codes caught this logic in clean lines. Gragas, the Icelandic compilation, reads like a checklist for disasters and duties. What the groom's kin pledge, what the bride's kin provide, who stands surety. The Norwegian Gulathing law, shaped at fjordside assemblies, likewise sets out how property flows into the marriage and how it flows back out. Not romantic, but it meant that when a door frame became a witness, people knew what was at stake. Light aside, if you've ever argued over a security deposit, you've brushed the Viking spirit of marital accounting. Inside the longhouse, the contract didn't feel like parchment. It felt like morning chores and evening seating. The household sat by status, elders near the high seat, guests where a host could see them, servants closer to the hearth. The house itself was a ledger in timber, storerooms marked by locked chests, the loom waiting one end with warp threads like lines on a balance sheet. Children learned quickly where they didn't sit and why. Even the feast that followed a wedding was part of the contract. Gifts flowed across the aisle in a pattern everyone watched. A sword to the bride's brother, a cloak to the groom's aunt, a chest to the foster father, whose word carried weight at the thing. The gifts weren't random. They distributed obligation like seeds. Later, when someone needed help settling a dispute or prying a son out of trouble, those gifts bloomed. There's an edge here that's easy to miss. A woman's authority at home didn't mean she could speak at the court. In many places and times, men represented families at the assembly. Yet the sagas keep returning to the moment a wife speaks to her husband by the fire and steers him more surely than a thing's speech would. Soft power, hard outcomes. Meanwhile, travelers notice the independence. One visitor in Hedeby wrote with surprise about women who chose, and sometimes unchose, their husbands. He was hearing the echo of contracts that gave women a say, because property and continuity demanded it. Light aside, call it the ancient version of check who's on the mortgage. And that's the paradox that powered Viking marriages. Affection could grow, but the bones were legal and economic. When it held, the structure gave families resilience. When it cracked, it offered a lawful way to step back. Which brings us to how those cracks formed, and the specific faults the law recognized when a doorframe had to listen. The law had a plain way to say something people hate to say out loud. If the bed stayed cold, the marriage could too. In the Icelandic Gragas, there's room for what the sagas call non-consummation, years passing without husband and wife sharing the bed as a married pair. It wasn't framed as romance gone stale. It was about duty. A household needed heirs, alliances needed glue, and a woman wasn't meant to be left in limbo while her husband's ship chased horizons. Here's how it worked in practice. If a husband settled abroad for trade or adventure and didn't return, and crucially didn't go to bed with his wife, for 3 winters the wife could stand in her doorway and speak the marriage apart. Witnesses gathered, as always. She would first declare it in the bed closet, by the bed itself, naming the lack. Then at the threshold, naming the time. Then at the yard where neighbors could hear. Those 3 moments drew a line between private duty, shared house, and public standing. If you're sensing a theme, yes. Viking law loved a good 3-step. Stakes were high. For the woman, 3 years without conjugal life meant more than loneliness. It meant uncertainty over children, inheritance, and her place in the web of kin. If her husband had built a second life in another harbor, she needed a lawful way to reclaim her dowry, secure her mourning gift, and step into a future that wasn't just waiting. For the man's kin, there was risk too. If she divorced, property would flow back out, obligations would shift. So everyone paid attention to the count of winters. Action unfolds in the sagas with small human details. A wife marks the passing Yules by the fat jar in the pantry. She folds the same linen coverlet every spring, washes it in the same stream. The bed stays neat. When the 3rd winter ends and the sheep are shorn, she calls her neighbors, 2 of her kin, 1 of his, and speaks the words. There's no shouting, just plain language, the kind that makes men lower their eyes. The bed, no use. The door, no return. The yard, no marriage. Impact ripples outward. Immediately, she takes possession of her property, the chest that came with her, the loom, the livestock named in the contract. The farm might reassign labor. A brother or foster brother steps in to help with hay. At the thing, the husband's kin might argue over compensation, but the grounds are clear. Meanwhile, neighbors adjust to a fact they can't ignore. The house has a new center of gravity. Impotence, now the part that makes people smirk. wasn't usually written in blunt medical terms, but the idea appears in the stories under the cover of jokes that aren't jokes. A husband mocked for being soft or useless at night might find his wife with legal leverage if the mockery matched reality. The law didn't care about insult. It cared about function. If a man couldn't fulfill the physical side of marriage, and if that failure wasn't a moment but a pattern, a wife could press her case. Gragas doesn't read like a doctor's note, but its spirit shows up when a wife cites non-consumption over years. Gulathing law, shaped on Norway's west coast, has its own rhythms and focuses more on blows and property, but the practical concern is the same. A marriage that doesn't produce the expected bond, social, sexual, economic, can be unmade if the community's markers are met. Light aside, think of it as the medieval version of "Are we even doing this?" Meanwhile, something else was happening in Christian lands to the south and east. In parts of Anglo-Saxon England and Frankish realms, ecclesiastical rules tightened around marriage, especially as church authority grew. Impotence could be grounds for annulment in church, courts, but the process moved through clerics and inquiries, not doorways and neighbours. It took time and permission. In Scandinavia's law world, the woman's voice, backed by witnesses at bed, door, and yard, could be enough. The difference isn't just legal, it's cultural. One system rooted legitimacy in clerical judgment. The other rooted it in communal testimony. This was the moment everything changed for some couples. No dramatic battle, just a cold bed named aloud. It didn't make anyone look heroic, and that's the point. Viking law made space for ordinary failures without demanding tragedy. It left room for the next chapter, often a remarriage that matched need and kin strategy better than the first. And the doorframe, once again, did its quiet work as a boundary between private life and public truth. Some grounds for divorce were about clothing, but not fashion. They were about where the line between man and woman sat in public, in a world where honor and role were stitched into what you wore. Crossing that line in daylight could rip a marriage. Start with the husband. In several saga episodes, a wife cites her husband's effeminate dress, low-cut shirts that bared the chest, soft fabrics, ornaments thought proper for women, as grounds to leave him. This isn't a throwaway gag. It taps an old Norse anxiety about ergi, unmanliness, social inversion. When husband walked into the hall wearing what looked like a woman's shirt front, he wasn't just showing skin. He was signaling a failure to inhabit his role. The marriage contract assumed a certain public masculinity, provider, protector, representative at the thing. Clothes that contradicted that role made a wife's position shaky. If her man appeared weak or mockable, her household standing dropped with him. The law codes don't list wardrobes the way a tailor would, but their spirit surfaces in saga cases that flow alongside Gulathing's concern for public acts. Norwegian law often framed dishonor through deeds done before witnesses. A slap was worse if others saw it. Likewise, these clothing violations mattered because they were public. If a husband's shirt marked him as other than man in front of neighbors, a wife could claim the alliance she'd entered was no longer the one she was promised. Light aside, this is less about V-neck depth and more about whether people still take your spouse seriously at the fish market. Now the wife. Bad pants is the short way to say something that made men's ears burn. A woman putting on breeches and appearing in public as if she were a man. We're not talking about borrowing warm layers in winter behind a cowshed. The issue was deliberate presentation in a male-coded garment, in a setting where eyes would read it. In sagas like Laxdela, a husband finds grounds to divorce when his wife strides out in trousers, belt, and sometimes weaponry, signaling a claim on male social space. In a culture that assigned public roles by gender, that outfit said, "I speak." Husbands could and did push back by unmaking the marriage. Stakes were immediate. For a husband, his wife's breeches could look like a challenge to his status. For a wife, her husband's woman's shirt could look like a threat to her security. The household's ability to trade, to win cases, to deter trouble, often rode on how others read the couple. Clothes were shorthand. When shorthand changed, the web of obligations tugged. Action followed a familiar script. The dissatisfied spouse gathered witnesses, as always, first in the bed closet, naming the breach of role that infected the private bond, then at the threshold, naming the public act and when it occurred, finally in the yard, tying the claim to the community. They didn't argue theology. They pointed to a day. On the third day after midsummer, my husband came to the feast wearing a low-cut shirt like a woman. Or, on the first market day after Yule, my wife wore pants to the booth and spoke like a man before buyers. The phrases landed because everyone saw it. Impact spread fast. A wife who left a soft-shirt husband reclaimed her dowry and mourning gift. Her kin rebalanced alliances towards steadier men. A husband who left a breached wife protected his public name and property shares defined in the contract. The children's placements, already guided by wealth and status, took the clothing scandal into account. Who could best secure their future without whispers? Meanwhile, at the Thing, elders argued the thin line between necessity and show. Was she dressed for field work out of need, or was she making a statement? Was he wearing a deep collar because of heat, or was he peacocking? Those debates mattered because intent cut through fabric. Here's where a comparison helps. In Anglo-Saxon and Frankish lands, church courts policed gender norms too, but divorce was rare and annulment hinged on impediments like consanguinity or impotence. Cross-dressing might earn penance, not a clean legal exit. In the Norse sphere, the communal nature of law let public breach of role become a marital fault when the community saw it and the spouse named it properly. No priest had to certify the shirt. None of this means Vikings were rigid mannequins. The same sagas show women taking on male tasks in emergencies without scandal, and men weaving or cooking at need. The red line was theatre, performing the other gender in public space where honor lived. Light aside, it's the difference between trying on Dad's coat in the barn and wearing it to the Thing to give a speech. So, when bad pants, or a bad shirt, turned a marriage, it wasn't about cloth. It was about whether the person beside you still fit the role your kin bargained for. And if not, the doorframe was waiting. Violence wasn't just pain, it was arithmetic. In Norse law, a blow entered the honor ledger like a bad debt, and if it kept showing up, the marriage could be called in. Gulathing law spells it plainly. A slap delivered before witnesses carried not only a fine, compensation equal to what she'd claim if any other man struck her, but after the third offense, it opened the door to divorce. 3 strikes wasn't a slogan, it was statute. The public part mattered. A strike no one saw could be handled inside the house. A strike with eyes on it stained more than skin. It marked standing. Stakes cut both ways. For a wife, violence risked more than bruises. A slap in the hall could unravel her authority in the home, invite mockery, and chill support from neighbors who now saw weakness where steadiness should live. For a husband, each blow increased legal risk, fines, loss of face, and after the third, the unmaking of his alliance with property obligations flowing back to her. His kin, ever aware of costs, had reason to take his temper in hand. Light aside, the uncle who says, "Maybe don't do that at the feast," was doing family risk management. Action followed the threefold path we've seen. After the first slap in public, she could claim compensation. After the second, the warning was clearer. The ledger now had a pattern. After the third, she gathered witnesses, first by the bed, naming the dishonor brought into the private space, then at the threshold, naming the repeated blows and the count, finally in the yard, linking the act to the community's judgment. Those announcements weren't theater, they were a legal chain. The doorframe heard violence translated into grounds. The sagas put names and faces to these lines. In Njal's saga, Halgerd's story isn't a law textbook, but it illustrates the social voltage of a slap. When a husband strikes her, she doesn't call witnesses for divorce, she calls kin to ruin. That escalates to blood. A reminder that law existed to keep insult from boiling into killing. The codes, Gragas and Gulathing, aimed to keep households from tipping into feud by offering a sober exit when tempers wouldn't cool. A slap before witnesses became not just a private humiliation, but a public breach that the law could cleanly cut away. Impact is immediate. After the third witness strike and the 3 announcements, the wife regains her dowry and mourning gift. If the marriage had common property, divisions follow what the contract said. In Iceland, Gragas tends to privilege clarity. Penalties fall heavier on the one causing the breach when it's clear. Children's placements follow the usual matrix. Babies with the mother, older ones split by wealth and support. But a violent record weighs on decisions. A man known to strike his wife in public won't have an easy time arguing for the teenager's place at his bench. Meanwhile, the husband's kin feel the ripple. They owe the fines if he can't pay. They lose the alliance's benefits. Labor promises grazing shares, political backing at the thing. In some communities, an elder might step forward after the second slap to mediate publicly, not out of sudden enlightenment, but to stop the next blow from costing cattle. Law and economics were not separate lanes. They were braided. This was the moment everything changed in the hall, not the first flare of temper, but the third repetition under eyes. The law's patience had a measured limit. 1 blow could be a mistake. 2 looked like a habit. 3 made a case. The rule did something subtle. It forced violence into the open and gave the community a script to end it without swords. Light aside, think of it as a medieval anger management program with fines. Compare this to Anglo-Saxon and Frankish practice. South of the Norse world, church courts increasingly treated marriage as a sacrament that weathered storms. Cruelty might invite separation from bed and board, sometimes penance for the man. But divorce, clean dissolution, was rare. A wife could seek protection, but not always a full return to single legal standing. In the North, the lay assemblies, Thing and Law Thing, recognized that honor lost in public had to be balanced in public, and if balance couldn't be restored, the bond could be cut. Gulathing's precision about before witnesses reflects a core Norse idea. Public wrongs demand public remedies. Gragas, with its Icelandic flavor, catalogues compensations and procedures with the same calm tone it uses for sheep trespass. That tone matters. It means a woman didn't have to turn her life into a saga to be heard. She had to count to 3, gather 2 or 3 good people, and speak in the right places. Then the law took over, turning a pattern of harm into a lawful exit. None of this romanticizes the age. Violence was common enough to need rules, but those rules gave a wife a lever and a community a way to keep blows from mutating into blood price. In a world where honor was math, the ledger could be balanced by ending the account. Abandonment had a number. 3 winters. Not a feeling, not a rumor. Time you could count on your fingers while the sheep thickened and thinned. In the North's law world, a marriage wasn't allowed to drift forever on hope. If a husband left and settled elsewhere, and crucially, didn't share the bed with his wife for 3 full years, she could unwind the knot with words and witnesses. That measure shows up in Icelandic practice echoed in Gragas. It's less poetry than procedure, but it carries a human beat. 3 Yules pass, 3 summers of hay, 3 harvests without a hand on the loom's beam at night. Then the doorframe hears the truth. The stakes for her were concrete. Without conjugal life, she stood in a fog. No children to anchor inheritance, no clarity over property, no protection if his new harbor grew into a second home. She couldn't wait forever because the household couldn't either. The hens still needed feeding, the roof patching, the debt settling, and kin weren't an endless purse. Alliances were built on predictable reciprocity. If he'd moved on in practice, the law let her move on in law. Light aside, 3 Winters was the medieval version of Don't Leave Me on Red. Action followed the familiar 3-step. She gathered witnesses, ideally 2 from each side, or at least credible neighbors. First, she spoke in the bed closet, naming the absence where intimacy should live. Then, at the threshold, she set the clock. 3 winters have passed without bed or return. Finally, in the yard, she made it public, so the community could measure her claim against its memory of his departure. If he'd been seen at other hearths, if his ship's name was whispered in other fjords, the testimony lined up. The law loved clean lines, she provided them. Impact began the moment the last words left her mouth. She assumed possession of her property, dowry, mourning gift, and what the contract specified if there was common wealth. In Icelandic fashion, Gragas tends to secure a woman's holdings once proceedings start, so they can't be siphoned by a distant husband's kin. Gulathing, in Norway's west, harmonizes on property clarity at the assembly. Who holds what, whose pledge binds whom. Either way, abandonment triggered a rebalancing. Her brothers or foster kin stepped in for heavy tasks until a new partnership, if any, was made. Babies weren't part of this scenario by definition, but if there were children from earlier years, their placements followed wealth and support patterns already in place. Meanwhile, his kin felt the economic tug. Bride price arrangements might unwind. Grazing shares and boat stakes shifted. If he returned after the lawful announcements, he came back to a door that didn't open to him as husband. The community would remember the sequence: bed, door, yard. He couldn't shout it away. To repair anything, he needed fresh agreements, not old claims. Set this beside Anglo-Saxon and Frankish norms, where church courts weighted abandonment differently. A spouse might secure separation or compel support, but full dissolution often stuck in ecclesiastical tar. In the Norse sphere, lay law trusted the calendar and communal site. 3 winters weren't negotiable feelings. They were seasons everyone lived through. The elegance of the rule wasn't softness, it was control. It kept households from freezing in uncertainty, kept kin from bleeding resources into a marriage that only existed on paper, and gave a woman a lawful path that didn't require spectacle. Light aside, it's amazing what a doorframe and a good memory for winters can do. There was a script, and if you missed a line, the law pretended it never happened. Divorce in the Norse world wasn't a feeling you announced at supper. It was a sequence, timed and witnessed, that turned private truth into public fact. The choreography mattered because property and honor moved only when words landed in the right places.